it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Let Me In by Will Rayne. When I was 10 years old, I heard a man die and did nothing to help. It's not something I'm proud of, but I was just a scared kid at the time. I was often left home alone when I was a child. I won't say my parents didn't love me or anything so dramatic, but they had priorities. And oftentimes, I was not high on that list. Still, I enjoyed the solitude. I had the run on the house, and could pretty much get away with whatever I wanted while they were gone. Well, as long as I made sure to clean up after myself. It was early February when it happened, while my folks were out on a part Valentine's part anniversary date. They'd married at this time of year around 15 years ago, so they'd make a big deal out of it annually. It was snowy outside. I wanted to go play in it while they were gone, but I had the biggest fear about inadvertently getting myself locked out of the house and freezing to death before anyone arrived to save me. It was close to 10 o'clock when my mum called and told me they wouldn't be home until morning. This would neither be my first nor last night alone in the house, so I assured her I'd keep the doors locked and get to bed at a reasonable hour. Surely what I considered reasonable and what she did were far different times. Were I being responsible, I would likely already be in bed, but I was happily in the middle of binging horror movies when she called. Oh, I won't say they never gave me nightmares, as my mother warned, but I still loved them. We had a great assortment of channels on our unlocked cable box, so it wasn't hard to track down movies to suit my late-night tastes. It was growing closer to midnight, and I felt my body begin to crave my bed when the commotion began outside. I peeked through the living room window to see a man screaming and running across the street. He was yelling out for anyone to help him. He even ran to some of the neighboring houses and pounded on their doors. "Help! For God's sake, somebody help me!" he cried out into the night, while he slammed his fists against doors and walls. Well, most houses just turned their lights off when all this began, but I couldn't look away. What could have got this guy worked up so? It's a typical suburban street I lived in as a kid. Little to nothing ever happened, aside from the occasional car pulled over for one reason or another. Well, finally the man arrived at my door. He beat his hands against the wood and shouted out, begging me to help. Oh, I was a kid. What the hell was I supposed to do? "Please, help me. They're coming," he yelled out from the other side of the front door. Well, I pulled a chair up to the door, and I stood up on it to look out through the peephole. The man looked young, maybe in his early 20s, though to my perception at the time, he might as well have been in his 60s. He had dark beard stubble and wore a thick blue hoodie, a knit cap and gloves. It was really cold outside, so I knew he had to be freezing. "Oh, please, just let me in," he whimpered softly. "Just help me. I'm begging you." Well, I felt bad for the guy, but I couldn't invite a stranger into the house, even if I believed he was truly scared. "I can't help you, mister," I called out to him. I hoped he would just move on to the next house after he heard that I was just a child, but it made him beg even harder. "Oh, please, kid, I won't hurt you. I just need to get off the street," he whined. "Sorry, my dad says I can't have people over," I said, hoping to rationalize with the man. "Just let me in, please," he asked softly. "I'm sorry, mister. I just can't. My dad'd kill me," I reasoned. And suddenly the man turned around, and I felt him push his back to the door. His head was right in front of the peephole now, and I couldn't see what was happening. "Oh, God," he said. I jumped down from the chair and ran to the living room window again. By the time I made it to the glass, he'd started screaming out and pounding on the door again. I heard the knob jiggle as he attempted to force his way in, but I had locked it and deadbolted it. "Jesus Christ, just let me in for God's sake, please!" He was wailing and his voice had given way to high-pitched shrieks. As I glared out through the window, I saw 3 dark shapes speeding across the road in front of my eyes. They were almost blurry, as if I was looking at an unfocused camera lens. I couldn't even make out where they were. They darted off the road and towards my house. I whipped the curtains closed and sat down on the floor under the window. Suddenly the man's yells changed into blood-curdling squeals. I heard more pounding against the door, as well as the walls of the house, along with a sound that reminded me of when my dad would cut the turkey at Thanksgiving. The yells turned to gurgles, and I heard something wet spray into the ground and the siding of my home. I heard snapping and crunching sounds, along with something like fabric being torn. After the man's gargling scream stopped, there was a chorus of shrill squeals that did not resemble anything I'd ever heard before. It reminded me of when I'd pinched the mouth of a balloon while letting the air out, only much louder and more guttural. After a moment, everything fell silent again, but I would not get off the floor until some time later. When I finally did emerge from my safe spot under the window, I ran up the stairs to my bedroom, locked the door, and hid under my blanket until I fell asleep. I was awakened the next morning by the sound of police sirens out front, accompanied by a loud knock on the front door. I peeked out of my bedroom window to see several police cars and a black SUV parked on the road in front of the house. I was too scared to answer the door since my folks had not arrived back home yet. I just stayed up in my room and ignored the hammering on the front door. After a while, the knocking stopped, but the police stayed out there until my parents drove up an hour or so later. My mum came flying through the front door and up the stairs. She tried to get in, but my door was still locked. She just pounded and shouted for me to let her in. Her words, along with the knocking, sent a shiver up my spine after the previous night's events. I swung the door open, and she pulled me into a hug. After a few minutes of holding me in place, she started grabbing at my arms, checking for injuries. Once she was certain I was okay, she asked me if I'd heard anything last night. Now, I'm not entirely sure why I lied to her and said I hadn't heard anything. Maybe I felt guilty about what I assumed had happened to the yelling stranger. Could have just been as simple as I didn't want my folks to know I'd stayed up so late. Well, sometime later, my father came inside after the swarm of vehicles in our street had thinned out. One of the cop cars and the black SUV stayed out front for a while, and 2 officers went to each house in the neighborhood. Well, it had been a bizarre series of events, but I paid it no mind after a couple of weeks passed. Sure, kids at my school spun many a rumor about the murder that had seemingly occurred on my street, though a body was never found. There was a great deal of blood that spread across the front of my parents' house and onto the driveway. Some would theorize it was way more than the human body was capable of holding, but there had been a lot of exaggerated stories over that first week. For several months after the man had begged to be allowed entry into my home, my parents refused to leave me at the house on my own. It was actually quite nice, if I'm being honest. Though I missed having the run of the place a bit, my folks were more attentive than they'd ever been. And again, I would never accuse them of being overly neglectful. They just never saw the danger in leaving the house with me as its only occupant until then. Of course, their new outlook didn't last for long. It was mid-December before I would be left alone again. My parents had a Christmas party to attend with some friends, so they asked if I'd be okay on my own. Given the fact I had no desire to be left with some babysitter who was only a few years older than me, I said I'd be fine. Well, truthfully, though I enjoyed them being more attentive these days, I did miss my solitude. As was usually the case, my mum checked in around 10ish, to which I informed her all was well. She told me they would likely be home around 1, and recommended that I try to go to bed soon. Well, of course, I didn't plan on hitting the sack until I saw the lights of my parents' Honda rolling into the driveway. But she didn't need to know that. After successfully riding my makeshift Captain America shield down the stairs several times in a row, I decided just to hunt for a good R-rated movie to buy my time until I had to head up to my bedroom. It was right around midnight when the knocking on the front door pulled my attention away from Jason steadily strolling after a fleeing topless girl. "Let me in," the voice called from outside. I instantly tensed up as my mind revisited the stranger who was left as nothing more than a bloody pool across the front lawn. My dad had ended up having to repaint the front of the house as the stains would not wash off. Even the concrete driveway still wore a few marks that would not clean up. "Come on, kid. Let me in," echoed from behind the door. I turned the volume up on the movie to attempt to block out the sounds. "Help me. Save me. Let me in," the voice called out, growing louder with every word. It wasn't like he was shouting. It was more like his vocal tones elevated in the same way I turned up the sound on the TV. Hesitantly, I crept over to the window to peer outside. I saw no evidence of anyone or anything. The whole neighborhood appeared to be at rest, but I still heard the man behind the door. "Just let me in. I won't hurt you, I promise," he called out again. I quietly carried the same chair over to gaze through the peephole. I froze in place after I accidentally bumped wood to wood while attempting to position my prop. "I know you're there, kid. Just let me in, please." Climbed up to glance through the small circular hole to see nobody out there. "Come on, kid. You can save me. You know that, right?" the invisible stranger asked. Certain that I'd eaten way too much candy or had just knocked myself senseless while sliding down the steps, I decided to just turn off the TV and head to bed. Even after I turned on the box fan I used to provide ambient sound to help me sleep, I could still hear the voice, which now sounded like it was coming from directly behind my second-floor window. I sandwiched my head between two pillows, but it made little difference in the volume of the cries for help. "Don't go to sleep and leave me out here, kid. All you have to do is just let me in," it begged. It wasn't until I saw the light trace across the far wall of my bedroom that signified my parents' arrival that the voice went silent. For years it carried on like that, always around midnight and only when I was alone. I got to the point of practically begging my folks not to leave when they'd be inevitably heading out for the night, and even requested a babysitter when they would. They agreed to my request for someone to watch over me while they were gone, but that ended when I turned 12. Sometimes I was able to arrange a sleepover with a friend, but there would be times I couldn't weasel my way out of being alone as the hour approached. Well, regardless of how often the voice would return, I was never able to just ignore it, or push it to the recesses of my mind while I focused on other things. When my folks would be gone all night, the voice wouldn't stop until I finally drifted off to sleep, which always required quite the struggle to achieve. As the years progressed and my school days ended, I went off to college where I'd have a roommate for a time. I'd involve myself in any activity that would keep me from being alone in my dorm room after hours. There were still those times I'd once again be at the mercy of the voice behind the door. No matter where I went in life, the stranger would follow, though there would never be evidence of his presence aside from the begging plea and knocks on the door. After college, I still maintained a roommate to avoid as many late-night visits as I could, though it wouldn't keep them away entirely. I couldn't exactly forbid my housemate from having a life, after all. For some years, I would only have to worry about the cries for help around the weekends. Unfortunately, when my roommate decided to move in with his girlfriend, I was shit out of luck. I'm sure I attempted to get another roomie, but my erratic and desperate behavior freaked most interested parties out. So every single night after my housemate moved out, the knocking and screaming came. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the volume would crank up higher and higher. I even tried checking into a busy motel for a night, hoping that the crowded hallways would keep it away, but no. As long as I was alone in my room, the pounding would begin again around midnight, without fail. For months I fought against my slipping sanity, but I could never block it out. Earplugs? No. Earphones with blaring music? No. Nothing would keep the man's begs for help from reaching my ears. Eventually, after way too many sleepless nights to count, I couldn't take it anymore. Just as many times before, I gazed through my peephole to reveal nobody there, though the calls and knocks still bellowed through. With a heavy sigh and a racing heart that felt as though it would crack through my sternum, I wrapped my trembling fingers around the doorknob and pulled it open. My jaw practically fell onto my chest when my eyes met the shredded figure in front of me. Half of his face had been torn away, leaving a reddened skull with strips of meaty tissue where skin once lay. His left arm had been ripped from his shoulder, and it was hard to differentiate the bloodied muscle and bone from the clumped threads of the shirt and hoodie that remained. His guts were splayed open, leaving oozing intestines hanging on the floor in a scarlet pool, and both of his legs were a gruesome combination of moist ground beef and bone, with little holding them in one piece. Somehow his right arm was the only part of him free of any manner of injury, which he still held out in front of him with his balled fist, in preparation to knock once more. "Thanks, man," he said, trying to smile with the one side of his face that still had the ability to do so. "You're a lifesaver," he continued, before he collapsed to the ground. In a series of snapping and squishing sounds, his body twisted and contorted as it smoked, bubbled and popped, shrinking down and dissolving into the fuzzy welcome mat and concrete pavement. Within seconds, all that remained of the stranger, who was only visible through the open door, was no more than a charred, crimson stain on the ground. I kicked at the damp mat that still wore the marks of many dirty feet, combined with the new red and burnt black, to find nothing hidden underneath it. But my mind was reeling, my mouth still hung agape. I strolled across the pathway that led away from my house, nudging the mat towards the garbage can that stood at the end of my driveway. I picked up the carpeted sheet that now read, "Welcome," on either end of the grisly stains, by one of the untouched corners, and dropped it into my trash bucket. I stood outside, staring back at my house, with my head in a daze. Could that really be all I had to do to put an end to this madness? Would my nightly visits finally be over? I began to cackle like a crazy person while I paced back to my open door, feeling like my remaining marbles may indeed be rolling out of the confines of my noggin for good. But before I could reach the entry to my home, I heard what sounded like a pack of wild animals thundering their feet across the ground behind me. I whipped around to see 3 hideous and deformed dog-like creatures scampering across the road towards me. Thick, phlegmy slobber dripped from their gaping maws as they sprinted at me on muscular legs, covered in matted, dreadlock fur. I screamed at the top of my lungs and hauled ass back through my doorway and slammed it shut behind me. I quickly flipped the deadbolt latch and pressed my back to the door while the beasts rammed into it from the other side. Wailing barks and growls blended with something that resembled the sound of a wood chipper might make if you threw 50 pounds of frozen food into it, was squalling from outside. They did not attack the actual door again after the initial slam from the quickly ceased high-speed pursuit. I had no doubt that, were they to attempt to force their way in, my simple locks would not keep them at bay for long. I glanced through the peephole again, to see the trio just pacing back and forth, still dripping that noxious drool with every whimper of their awful sounds. Each of them were quite large, easily twice the size of the largest dog I'd ever seen. Their bodies and limbs bulged with rippling muscles, and their mouths were filled with jagged and misshapen yellow teeth. Every one of the 6 enlarged eyes glowed a vibrant orange beneath their furrowed brow. Accepting that another sleepless night was ahead of me, I drew my largest kitchen knife from the rack beside my stove and sat on my couch, trembling from head to toe. Of course, I had no doubt that a paltry blade used for preparing a meal would provide little defense against the horrendous beasts, but I just gripped onto the hilt like a safety blanket and prayed they wouldn't try to force their way inside. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, and by the time the sun rose, the beasts had moved on, as far as I could tell anyway. I slowly pulled my door open to reveal nothing but the stained concrete behind it. I felt on edge for the rest of the day, but nothing else appeared out of place while I went about my daily grind. It wasn't until I was on my way home, after dining with some friends after work, that I understood the new troubling situation I would be forced to endure. The sun began to set on my drive back to my house, something that had never made me nervous before, not until midnight anyway. By the time I arrived on my street, the world was now lit by the subtle glow of the moon. Well, it was then that I heard the barking and growling again. I dived my eyes to my rear-view mirror to see the three matted creatures speeding at me from behind. I slammed my foot to the floor, causing my Nissan to speed faster across the road to my house than I would have ever dared before. I was terrified at the idea of kids playing on the street or absent-minded drivers drifting into my lane, but I had to outrun those things and reach the safety of my home. I skidded into my driveway and felt my right tire lift from the ground as the left one spun to a halt, tearing into the grass and dirt of my front lawn. My heart was hammering against my chest again while I sprinted to my front door. Oh, I could practically feel the foul breath of the demonic hellhounds on the back of my neck as I fumbled my key against the knob in my attempt to gain entry. I dared not look behind me until I'd finally achieved success and tripped onto the floor, kicking the door shut with my heel. I rolled over and reached up to latch my lock when I heard and felt the hard slam of the monstrous creatures, beginning another night of their atrocious wails calling from outside. So this is how I live now. I never stay out after dark, no matter what. I feel a panic attack building up whenever I see the sun begin to recede for the night, whether I am safely behind my walls or not. I don't date. I don't socialize. Those things only lead to the inability to put a door between me and my stalkers when night falls. Well, I can't say mine is a happy existence, but I am alive. I wonder sometimes if I'd allowed that stranger entry the first time he begged for it, would I be where I am now, or would he have transferred this curse to me sooner? Somehow I doubt I'll ever have answers. But there has to be a way out of this, right? Well, if you take nothing else from this tale, just remember this. Should I ever come knocking on your door after dark, no matter how hard I beg, no matter how much I cry, do not even acknowledge me. And for God's sake, don't let me in. The clock struck midnight. I was on my laptop in my bedroom, browsing through YouTube videos. However, my browsing stopped when my phone vibrated. I saw that I'd received a message from my friend Ben. "Hey man, I'm outside by the back door. Can you let me in?" I knew he was lying. For the last few weekends, he'd been messing with me. One weekend he told me he was parked in my cul-de-sac when, in reality, he was in his bedroom. The following weekend, he told me he was coming over to hang out. When I came outside to greet him in his car, he floored it out of my neighborhood. I wasn't going to let him get me this time. I sent a reply back. "I know you're just messing with me again." He immediately replied back, "No, I'm being serious this time. I'm by the back door." Nice try. I know you're not there. I placed my phone down and continued my search. About a minute later, my phone vibrated again. "I'm downstairs." "Ben, you can't troll me 3 weekends in a row. However, I will give you an A for effort." I placed my phone down again. I wasn't going to play his little game. I was about to continue my search when I started to hear something from the deafening silence of my dark house. I faced the doorway behind me and listened closely. It sounded like footsteps. Silent footsteps walking around downstairs. It was nerve-wracking. I couldn't believe it. Was my mind tricking me? Or was Ben actually in my house? I grabbed my phone. Are you joking with me, man? I continued to listen as my phone vibrated again. No, I told you I was downstairs, but you didn't believe me. I was quite relieved that it was him, but I was pissed off that he'd broken into my house. I could hear him walking around downstairs still as I waited for him to come into my bedroom. I grabbed my phone again. Hey, aren't you going to come upstairs? I can hear you walking around downstairs. Just come up here already. I sent the message and waited for him to respond. I was starting to get a little annoyed after a minute of waiting. I got up from my bed and went to the doorway. I proceeded to shout downstairs. Get your ass upstairs already. Stop fucking around. I sat back on my bed as I began to hear him walk upstairs. Suddenly, my phone vibrated again. It was a text message from Ben. You know I was fucking with you, right? My heart dropped. I looked up at the doorway to see my killer smiling at me. Things had been tough for my mum and I ever since my dad left us 2 years ago. At least I was old enough to get myself to and from school, and I knew my way around a microwave. But I wasn't old enough to get a job, and the bills were piling up. So, my mum decided to get a second job, a night job. Maybe part-time, and not something to brag about, but it would keep our heads above water. I remember the first night like it was yesterday. My mum apologizing up and down for having to leave me alone. I told her I'd be fine, and, honestly, I was pretty excited. She wouldn't be home until late, and that meant I could stay up late. There was a monster movie marathon on, so who would complain? It was just around 9:30, and I was right in the thick of some Japanese gore fest when I swore I heard something outside. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the movie got to me. Either way, I had to check it out. I hesitantly peered out of the living room window, looking to the left, then the right, and nothing. Then I noticed, directly across the way, a man standing in his window, just staring. I couldn't really tell what he was staring at, but it freaked me out anyway. I stood at the window for at least a minute, as long as my heart could bear it, and he didn't move. That was it for me that night. I was done with the monster flicks, done with the freaky dude in the window, and so tried to fall asleep. The next morning I told my mum about the man. At first she was upset I was up so late, and then asked if I'd been watching scary movies. Needless to say, I got the "it was all in my imagination" thing, and that was that. That night, after my mum left, I didn't feel comfortable alone. It was like that feeling of someone watching you, and just after 9 again, I swear I heard something. It was just like the last time, except there was no horror movie marathon this time. Against what my brain was screaming at me, I pulled myself again to the window. There he was, the man, just staring out of his window. This time I darted away as quick as I could and ran to my room. It was Just so weird. It got the hairs on my neck standing on end. The next morning I told my mum, but again she just brushed it off, saying he was probably just a nervous old man, and it had nothing to do with me. I wasn't so sure, but what could I do? My mom left for work again that night, even though I begged her to stay. I tried to take my mind off the man. I watched TV, played music. I even did all of my homework, but I still wondered if he was out there, staring from his window at me or God knows what. My curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way slowly to the window. My fear was realized in that moment because there he was, the man in the window, just staring. I tried to keep my presence a secret and see just how long he would stand there. My heart felt like it was going to leap out of my chest, but I stayed there at the window, in some sort of weird staring contest. Then it happened. He moved away from the window and I breathed a sigh of relief. My mum was right. There was nothing to be worried about. Suddenly, his front door opened and my comfort changed to dread in an instant. I watched from my window, trying my best not to be seen, watching him walk down his driveway, then across the street, and then up my driveway. I choked in fear and ran for the telephone. I dialed 911 and waited, my heart jackhammering 1,000,000 miles an hour. Finally, an answer. I explained to the lady that I thought someone was trying to break in my house, and she said help would be on the way and asked for my address. I managed to get out the first 3 numbers when I was grabbed from behind. I dropped the phone and felt these dirty, greasy hands wrap themselves around me. I screamed as loud as I could and shook myself, trying to break free, but I was lifted from the ground. I could feel the hot breath on my neck, smell the stale, rotten stench of my attacker. I couldn't help but start crying, screaming my lungs out for my mum, for anyone, for help. Then there was a thud, and I was falling with the man towards the floor. We hit the ground and his grip loosened. I rolled away and scrambled behind the couch. Then I heard a voice say, "It's okay. You're safe now." I looked up, shaking and bewildered. There were 2 men, one on the floor who wasn't moving, and another standing there with a baseball bat. "You're okay," he said again. "I'm your neighbor from across the way." My jaw dropped in confusion. "Listen, I've noticed a strange man lurking around your house every night for the last few days, and was concerned you might be in danger. I noticed your mom leaving and knew you were here all by yourself." The police arrived shortly afterwards, and, between our 2 stories, the mysterious assailant was taken into custody. I thanked my neighbor as much as I could, and from that day, I always felt safer when I looked outside and saw the staring man in the window across from me. I used to work for a Subway next to a liquor store along a fairly busy road. I hated the job, but I was only working there on Friday and Saturday evenings to make some extra money. The customers were friendly enough, referring to me as the blue-eyed girl, as we didn't have name tags. My co-workers were alright as well, being fun and interesting people, but my boss was a jerk. Luckily, I didn't have to see him often because he was only around during the mornings. Yet, he'd always find a way to make my job more stressful. My boss would constantly say that our store was doing poorly in profits, and would make it so that only one person would be working for hours alone. I have no idea what he was talking about, because whenever I was working, I felt as though every resident in our city would make an appearance at some time during my shift. Luckily, I had a co-worker with me until about an hour before close, something I was truly grateful for. But all that changed after minimum wage went up. My boss figured he'd save the money he was losing by cutting hours even more. So, instead of working with someone until 8:30 or 9 p.m., I would be alone from 6 p.m. until close. Something that worried my mother and my boyfriend. They didn't particularly like the thought of me being alone in the store for that long. I didn't like the thought of it either, but what could I do? I dreaded the following weekend, when the new schedule would be in effect. On Friday, my boyfriend agreed to stay with me until close, but on Saturday he couldn't, and so I begrudgingly made my way to work for 5 p.m. that day. I worked with someone else until 6, and then they left. I was now in the store alone. I was hoping it would be dead in the store since a football game was on that night, and this proved to be true. Not many people came in. So, with the spare time, I started cleaning things early, as I knew it would take a lot longer to get everything done without anyone else helping me. And I'd bring many empty containers to the back room to wash them, returning to the front whenever I heard the door alarm go off, signaling that a customer had just walked in. This went on for a couple of hours, and I hated every moment of it. I was in the back at about 9 p.m, trying to finish washing some things, when I heard the door alarm go off. We'd be closed in about half an hour, so this was the point in my shift where I truly despised getting any customers. I finished rinsing the bowl I was washing, and then reached for a paper towel, walking to the front to greet my unwanted customer. Much to my surprise, no one was there. I didn't see any cars out front, but I looked around the store briefly before returning to the back room. Whoever it was, they must have decided they didn't want anything. Not that I minded. A couple of minutes passed, and then I heard the door alarm go off again. I briskly walked to the front, expecting a customer to be standing there looking at the menu. But when I got there, I didn't see anyone standing ready to order. Instead, I found a man sitting on the far end of the store at the back table. He appeared to be dirty, with scraggly hair and mud all over his pants. I could see that he'd tracked some in, and wasn't too happy about knowing that I'd have to re-mop the floors. Despite my irritation, I greeted the man. "Hello, sir. Are you waiting on someone, or wanting a minute to look over the menu?" He kept looking back and forth, from wall to wall, and occasionally out of the window. He almost appeared disoriented, but would look at his phone every once in a while, as though he were expecting a message from someone. He was fiddling with something in his pocket, but wouldn't take it out. Most importantly, he didn't respond to my question, and I was getting pretty annoyed. "Well, we'll be closing in 20 minutes, sir. Please keep that in mind." Again, he didn't respond. Just kept looking everywhere and anywhere but toward me. With an irritated sigh, I walked to the back room and began preparing the mop bucket, filling it with water and floor cleaner. This probably took about 2 minutes. Once it was ready, I wheeled it toward the front and quickly noticed that the man wasn't there anymore. He couldn't have left the store, however. I would have heard the door alarm go off if it had been opened. I grabbed my mop and looked toward the ground, where I then noticed a set of muddy footprints leading toward the bathroom door. Great. I'll have to mop the bathroom again too. I began mopping the trail leading toward the table where the man had sat, and then all the way toward the bathroom door. As I finished cleaning the floor directly in front of the door, I heard the faint, muffled cries of someone on the other side. I leaned in until my ear was almost against the door itself and listened silently. I could hear quiet sobs mixed with some words like, "No," and "I can't." What on earth was going on in there? I took a step back as quietly as I could and then was surprised by the sound of the door being unlocked. I immediately jumped away with mop in hand and was a good 10 feet away when the door opened. The man emerged and stood there for a couple of moments when he saw me standing there. Then, for the first time, he looked me straight in the eye. This sent a chill down my spine. I held onto the mop nervously, almost defensively. His stare was blank, and yet somehow sorrowful. He didn't say anything and quickly walked out the front entrance, setting off the door alarm. I turned and saw him make his way down the road, never looking back. I took a deep breath, loosening my grip on the mop, and looked back toward the bathroom door. I reached for the handle and slowly opened the door, quickly peering around inside before actually entering. When I walked inside, I found a giant muddy mess all over the floor, as though the man had been walking in circles there. I sighed and quickly mopped up the filth and turned to leave when I noticed the garbage can lid was on the ground beside it. I reached for it, bending over the can itself in order to retrieve it, when I happened to notice something shining inside. I could feel my face grow pale when I reached in and retrieved an open switchblade. The only other thing in the can was a crumpled piece of paper. I reached for it and slowly opened it. The words on it still haunt me to this day. 435 Wilson Road, brunette, blue eyes, Saturday 9 p.m., $1,200. I closed the store early that night. I didn't finish washing the dishes and I didn't bother sweeping or mopping the back room. I just locked the door, put the food away, counted my drawer and left. I quit the next day. I told my mom what had happened and she called the police. I gave them my description of the guy, as well as the knife and note I'd found. They thanked me for my information and told us they'd do what they could to find the guy. My mom still freaks out about it and won't let me get another job. I don't go out as often and I feel nervous every day. I always feel as though I'm being watched or hunted. I still wonder about that note sometimes, but in all honesty, I don't want to know. Whoever wrote it, whoever wanted to hurt me, I don't want to know. I may never know anyway, but one thing I do know.
is that I'll never work a closing shift again.
So, an interesting collection of stories there for your Friday evening's entertainment. Not quite as long as I usually like to do on a Friday, but, well, I had a huge day. Morning classes, a very entertaining class with a fantastic bunch of students up in Venlo, which is a city in the Netherlands. Online, of course, due to, well, you know what. Followed by a return trip to Düsseldorf Airport and back. So an exhausting day, but it's Friday. I know you're all depending on me for some entertainment in the evening, so I don't like to disappoint. Oh, that is it for this week. We started off the new year in some fine style, and I'll keep going, probably back on Sunday, if not definitely on Monday. There was an episode of the podcast last night, just in case you missed it, so go check it out. Well, my dear friends, till next time, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.